Hello and welcome. This is Tim64 aka On the Stoop with a 10-minute training video. And today's topic is going to be when to slow play and when not to slow play. Now, the more observant of you will have noticed that I'm speaking in a slightly different accent today. No particular reason for that. I thought I would just change it up, go a little bit transatlantic, so you'll have to imagine that I'm just sipping margaritas on Long Beach while I'm dictating this. Okay, so let's just talk about slow play in general. A lot of people, when they get dealt the nuts or they get dealt a hand and they flop the nuts, automatically go into slow play mode. They think, okay, I have the best possible hand here. I don't want to scare my opponent off. I don't want to lose value. And also, a little bit of them thinks, well, if I just make my hand look weak, maybe my opponent will start bluffing. And what they really want to happen is on the river their opponent bluff shoves all into them and they just snap call with the nuts. And I mean, there are few better feelings in poker than just calling off with the nuts. But that doesn't mean that the slow play is always the right play. A lot of times, if we don't take the time to put our opponent on a range of hands and decide what we want to do against that range of hands, we're going to be losing value. So if you automatically slow play, as a matter of course, you're probably going to be making an error. So let's jump into this first hand and see what happens. It's folded around to us on the button. We have pocket deuces and we raise it up. Let's have a look at our opponents in the small blind, the big blind. We have one guy's full stacked, and we have another guy in the big blind who's lost 2/3 of his stack already. If you have a look at their stats, VPIP of 47 and 43 respectively, it's very likely these guys are going to be weak players. I'm not expecting to get two folds here, and I'm just hoping really to flop my set. And there's not really much else to this hand pre-flop. We get one caller, we get two callers, and there we go. Full house. Alright, so now comes the plan of what are we going to do with our hand. Well, let's first of all start by collecting some information. We're in position. We get to see what our opponents do first. So small blind leads out for like 1/9 pot, and the big blind flats here. And now we have to put them on ranges. Well, given that the small blind has a VPIP of 47%, I think this, and given the bet size, I think this really could be literally any two cards. It could be something with some equity, like a flush draw, or a hand like 3-4. It could be a hand like, pocket sevens, which is wanting to find out where it is. It could be total air, ace high, really the whole range. I think when the big blind calls, it's probably unlikely that he has pure air here. So I don't expect the big blind to call with a hand like, 9-10 here. I expect him to fold. So he probably has a little something. And it's back on us, and we have to decide what to do. Now, I think raising here is going to be a mistake. And the reason is I don't put these guys on strong hands yet. We haven't got enough information to do that, and I think if we raise here, we're going to get a lot of folds, and that's the one thing that we don't want when we have the nuts, is to get a lot of folds. So I opt for a call here, even though it's at the price of not really getting as much money into the pot as I would like to. But again, we can't just say I have the nuts, let's put all the money in, because if our opponents have nothing, we're going to be losing value. So we get to the turn. Turn is a great card for us. Definitely improves our opponent's ranges. 3-4 got there. The flush got there. Obviously, if one of these players has a 6, they're not really ever getting away from it despite the board. I don't think people play 40% VPIP to be folding trips. So I'm not worried about that. I'm really worried about trying to get a bit more value from a wider range. Okay, so small blind leads. It's a slightly bigger bet size. But again, still not indicating a great deal of strength. And at this point, BB makes a min raise. And this is really awesome for us because I think that the chances of him having a 6 or a flush are pretty good now. The good thing about the big blind stack size is that if he does have one of those two hands, he's definitely committed whatever we do. So we're really not too interested in what's the optimal play against the big blind. It's really a case of how do we get the small blind to stay in the hand. If I raise here, I'm basically representing two hands. I'm representing a flush and I'm representing a full house or trips. So I think I'm going to force a lot of folds out of the small blind if I raise here. So once again, we just call here. And let's get to the river. Small blind calls, so that's encouraging. And we get to the river. And it's more or less a blank. I mean, we shouldn't imagine that this river hits either of our opponents. So once again, we're in position. We get to see what our opponents do before deciding on our own action. Okay, so now the small blind min bets, and I think really this is just a stab with air. That's what it certainly should be. And big blind raises, and I think now is the time that we can declare our hand. We know that the big blind is committed at this point, so we don't need to worry about scaring him off. Clearly he's going to put in his 180 chips remaining if he has any kind of a hand. And I think the small blind's probably folding whatever we do, so there's no reason not to jam here, because if somehow the small blind is playing, you know, in a strange way with a 6 or a flush, he's not going to be able to fold for jam. But if we make it, 400 here, he might just call the 400 instead of re-raising us. So we put the rest of our stack in, and small blind calls, which is fantastic. Big blind calls. As I say, we know big blind is calling already. And let's see what they have at showdown. Okay, so small blind has king queen off. Not a hand we can really ever put him on, given the way he played the hand, but the river is a really great piece of luck for us, and if we'd raised at any point in this hand, we would have forced this hand to fold. We're not surprised to see big blind has trips here. I don't think he really should be doing much different here, given the way the hand was played. I mean, he's got top trips, so he's got the nuts from his point of view. I think that he probably should have considered making a raise on the flop versus the minimum dock, but okay, I mean, no big deal from him. I think the big culprit here is the small blind, who, despite all the action, felt that top pair was going to be good here on the river. But like I said, if you slow play without a reason, you're going to lose value. And now let's look at another hand where slow playing is going to cost us money. Okay, so here we are with another monster hand. This time not pocket deuces, but ace deuce in the big blind. And we get a min raise from under the gun, and it's folded round to the button. Okay, and at this point we need to categorize our opponents. So let's first look at under the gun. We have 176 hands on him, and he has a VPIP of 24, pre-flop raise of 14, and I think what we'd probably categorize him as something of a passive player. There's a big gap between VPIP and pre-flop raise, which means he's probably not raising that many hands, and when he does raise, he's more likely to have a strongish range, but he probably plays passively in general. Let's look at the button now. He has a VPIP of 64. We have a small sample of hands, but I think it's very unlikely that this is going to turn out to be a tight, strong player, and much more likely he's going to be a very loose recreational player. Once the small blind folds, therefore, I think it's reasonable of us to make the call for the 20 chips, getting odds of 5.5 to 1. We have an awkward kind of hand. When we flop something, it's usually going to be either bottom pair with top kicker, which is going to be a lot of times worthless, or top pair with no kicker, which once again, we're going to win some small pots, but if the pot starts getting bigger, we're probably going to be behind to a better ace. So when we call here, it's with the expectation that we're going to have to make some tough laydowns post-flop, but the odds combined with our assessment of these players are weak, make it not too unreasonable, and once in a while we're going to flop a nice gut shot to a wheel, or maybe a wheel, or some trips, or two pair, and that's when we can start getting the money in with a little bit more confidence. Okay, so we call and we flop the stone called nuts. This time we don't have to be worried about being coolered with like quad sixes or anything. We have the nuts, and now once again we have to think about the best way to play this hand. And I think we can definitely check here, but what I think we must never do is check raise. When we check raise this board, we're representing only two kind of hands. We're representing pure air, and we're representing a deuce. I don't think we would ever check raise with a hand like pocket sevens here, because we're basically turning that hand into a bluff. So I think number one thing we must not do is check raise. We don't want to frighten away hands that we could get value from. But at the same time, we do want to build the pot. And I think a lot of times if we just check here, we're gonna get a lot of hands checking back. So hands like ace queen that the under the gun player might have, might definitely consider checking back here. The button is very unlikely. Well, obviously no one can really have hit this board, and the button's range is not strong enough to assume that he would bet here if we check, because if he were a tighter player we might put him on a lot of pocket pairs, but I think this guy can just have any two cards, and looking at his aggression factor over a small sample, he's pretty passive. No reason to think he'd bet, and for all those reasons we just go for a lead here. We want to start building the pot, but we don't want to over-represent our hand. We don't want to make people fold aces by check raising against a bet. Okay, so we get called by UTG, and we get called by button. Really hard to put these guys on ranges. I think it's perfectly reasonable for under the gun to have a pair here and just decide not to raise. I think under the gun can also have some, decent ace high hands like ace jack ace queen, which he's going to call on this board at least once because he just clearly doesn't believe that I would ever lead with quads here. Button again, I think he can have a pretty wide range, but the most likely hand for him right now is a pocket pair. So we get to the turn. We're really praying that one of these guys has pocket fours here and just made a full house. Once again, I don't think that there's much benefit in checking here. I think a lot of hands will just check back wanting to get to showdown. So we want to keep building the pot. And here the key is, what kind of bet sizing do we use here? In order to shove the river, we're going to have to make a very big bet size if we only get one caller. Okay, so we'd need to bet something like 300 here to be able to get our full stack in reasonably on the river. Let's just move this up so you can have a look at the stack sizes. But more important than that is really seeing if there's any way of getting two callers here, a bit like the first hand. So we're going to bet a reasonable size here. You could argue for a little bit more, you could argue for a little bit less here. Again, I don't want to bet so much here that it makes it clear to my opponents that I really want to get stacks in. I want to be betting an amount that I could still be bluffing here, or maybe betting with a hand like pocket sixes, which maybe I think is the best hand. Okay, now I get a fold from UTG. Very likely he had just ace high. I don't think he's folding a pair there. But button calls. And now we get to the river. The club flush got there. Now against a good player, I might want to think about making a reasonable size bet here so that I'm not, too clearly polarized. I want to bet, like, I might want to bet 500 here so that I can continue to represent a hand like pocket 10s in order to try to get a call from pocket 9s or something like that. But against this guy, I'm not really worried about balancing my bet size. I just want to get my stack in and see if he can find a reason to call me. Okay, so we just put the rest in and he calls. Now when he calls her, I'm really expecting to see a hand like, pocket sixes, pocket sevens that just doesn't believe me. So I'm pretty surprised when he shows ace 3, and I guess that, when he calls on the turn, he somehow thinks he has a gut shot there, or whatever it is. I think the most important thing is that he just doesn't think that if you had quads, you would be betting this way. So he just probably thinks maybe ace high is even good on the river, and then when he rivers a full house, like we know, no one can fold a full house. So we get kind of max value against our hands there. So today's lesson is all about just trying to think about what your opponents might have, what they would do with their possible hands, and not just always slow playing when you have the nuts, but trying to get maximum value against your specific opponents. Alright, well I hope you enjoyed that. Do let me know if you want to hear any more unusual voices for your 10-minute coaching sessions, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. This is Tim64, aka On the Stoop.